1 Samuel chapter 28. And it comes to pass in those days that the Philistines gather their camps for war, to fight against Israel. And Achish says to David, You certainly know that you go out with me into the camp, you and your men. And David says to Achish, Therefore you know that which your servant does. And Achish says to David, Therefore I appoint you keeper of my head for all the days. And Samuel has died, and all Israel mourns for him, and buries him in Ramah, even in his city. And Saul has turned aside those having familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. And the Philistines are gathered, and come in, and encamp in Shunem. And Saul gathers all Israel, and they encamp in Gilboa. And Saul sees the camp of the Philistines, and fears, and his heart trembles greatly. And Saul inquires of Yahweh, and Yahweh has not answered him, either by the dreams, or by the lights, or by the prophets. And Saul says to his servants, Seek a woman for me possessing a familiar spirit, and I go to her, and inquire of her. And his servants say to him, Behold, a woman possessing a familiar spirit is an En-dor. And Saul disguises himself, and puts on other garments, and goes, he and 2 of the men with him. And they come to the woman by night, and he says, Please divine to me by the familiar spirit, and cause him whom I say to you to come up to me. And the woman says to him, Behold, you have known that which Saul has done, that he has cut off those having familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. And why are you laying a snare for my soul, to put me to death? And Saul swears to her by Yahweh, saying, Yahweh lives. Punishment does not meet you for this thing. And the woman says, Whom do I bring up to you? And he says, Bring up Samuel to me. And the woman sees Samuel, and cries with a loud voice. And the woman speaks to Saul, saying, Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. And the king says to her, Do not fear, for what have you seen? And the woman says to Saul, I have seen gods coming up out of the earth. And he says to her, What is his form? And she says, An aged man is coming up, and he is covered with an upper robe. And Saul knows that he is Samuel, and bows face to the earth, and pays respect. And Samuel says to Saul, Why have you troubled me to bring me up? And Saul says, I have great distress, and the Philistines are fighting against me. God has turned aside from me, and has not answered me any more, either by the hand of the prophets or by dreams. And I call for you to let me know what I should do. And Samuel says, And why do you ask me? And Yahweh has turned aside from you, and is your enemy. And Yahweh does for himself as he has spoken by my hand. And Yahweh tears the kingdom out of your hand, and gives it to your neighbor, to David. Because you have not listened to the voice of Yahweh, nor did the fierceness of his anger on Amalek. Therefore Yahweh has done this thing to you this day. Indeed, Yahweh also gives Israel into the hand of the Philistines with you. And tomorrow you and your sons are with me. Yahweh also gives the camp of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. And Saul hurries and falls, the fullness of his stature, to the earth, and fears greatly because of the words of Samuel. Also power was not in him, for he had not eaten bread all the day and all the night. And the woman comes to Saul, and sees that he has been greatly troubled, and says to him, Behold, your maidservant has listened to your voice, and I put my soul in my hand, and I obey your words, which you have spoken to me. And now, please listen, you also, to the voice of your maidservant. And I set a morsel of bread before you. And eat, and there is power in you when you go in the way. And he refuses, and says, I do not eat. And his servants urge him on, and also the woman. And he listens to their voice, and rises from the earth, and sits on the bed. And the woman has a calf of the stall in the house, and she hurries and slaughters it, and takes flour and kneads, and bakes it into unleavened things, and brings them near before Saul and before his servants. And they eat, and rise, and go on during that night.